So welcome, my name is Susan Neely and I'm a counselor in Washington State. And today I'm going to talk about how to deal with baggage from the past. And since this is such a large category, I'm going to define it as childhood wounds and the adaptive strategies we carry into and live out of in adulthood. So I'm going to go over some examples of childhood wounds and adaptive strategies that show up in adulthood. And by adaptive strategies, I mean all the ways we try to cope in order to feel safe in the world. So this isn't a comprehensive list, this is just to get you thinking. So the first childhood wound is that the caregivers are unpredictable and cold and distant and maybe preoccupied, but there's also kindness and care. So the key point here is that it was inconsistent. And so an adaptive strategy may be that there's hypervigilance or worst case scenario thinking. And so an example may be you have high anxiety in relationships, you're convinced your partner's going to cheat on you, you might be checking their phone, and you might be suspicious of where they've been. Or you sabotage relationships with unfounded accusations. The next childhood wound is that maybe you experience conditional love. Love was purchased with good behavior, and maybe you were the good one. And so adaptive strategy could be people-pleasing or a need to be liked. An example, you volunteer when no one else will, you say yes when you want to say no, and you might be resentful with how much you're giving. And so the third childhood wound is that the parents look to the child to get their needs met. You felt loved when you were needed. And so the adaptive strategy may be you take on the role of a caregiver, maybe you're the rescuer, or you are the stable one. The fourth childhood wound is that the child experienced early loss. There was an absence of nurturing through sickness or death of a caregiver, or the caregiver may have struggled with addiction. And so the adaptive strategy here is an avoidance of pain, or maybe a dismissing of negative feelings. So an example is that you might be quick to look on the bright side. You explain negative feelings in yourself or others. Or you might find yourself saying things like, it's all good. It is what it is. Or, things happen for a reason. So how did these adaptive strategies develop? So our adaptive strategies developed, we are constantly exposed to certain experiences or feelings of being unsafe. Our needs weren't met, we weren't understood, and we weren't seen. And this was the way that we adapted to the limitations of our caregiver. We did this to protect our need for love and belonging. Even if it paradoxically meant that we shut down our need for connection. This was a way that we felt safe. And so the adaptive strategies also impact identity because while we preserved and protected ourselves from the fear that we're unworthy of love and belonging, we ended up assuming an identity that was fear-based. And so it's important to note that so much of this is unconscious. You don't realize you're doing it. So if you're interested in learning more about how our attachment with primary caregivers affects our development and relationships, the book, The Power of Attachment, How to Create Deep and Lasting Intimate Relationships is a great place to start. So I'm going to invite you to participate in a simple exercise. So I want you to think back on childhood, birth through middle school, and think back on what were the wounds that impacted you. So these early experiences become the foundation for your adaptive strategies. This was the way you survived in a broken world. So I want to share with you a personal example. When I was in middle school, I experienced rejection from my friend group, and it devastated me. At the time, I was in 7th grade, and my parents were going through divorce. And so our home was distant and cold. So I relied heavily on this friend group for support. So many of us had parents who were going through divorce, and so we functioned like a little family. I loved exploring the ideas of feelings and ideas with these girls. I remember the late night sleepovers, listening to our parents' records and dissecting the lyrics to Simon and Garfunkel albums. This type of connecting was so powerful for me. But slowly, I felt the distance in the group. I could join them, but I wasn't pursued by them. And then one evening, the distance became so unbearable that I just started crying. I said, I don't think you want to be friends with me anymore. I don't think you like me anymore. And then while some friends tried to console me and other friends were more dismissive, I didn't hang out with them after that evening. We weren't friends anymore. And so the childhood wound was, if I express my need, I will be abandoned. And the strategy I developed and lived out of well into my late 20s was that if I don't need anyone, I won't be left. So, what is at the heart of relational wounds? Shame is at the heart of relational wounds. And the definition I'm going to use is from Brené Brown's research in her book, Daring Greatly. Shame is an intensely painful feeling and experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. We learn how to change our behaviors, thinking, and feeling to avoid shame. In the process, we changed who we were and are today. So shame ultimately disconnects us from self, others, and God. So what does it look like to be disconnected from the self? Well, we become disconnected from our bodies because we are overwhelmed with the sensory and emotional experiences. This could be cause from rejection, witnessing high conflict in the home, or neglect, for example. So the consequences of being disconnected from our internal experience for too long is that we struggle to know how we feel. We have trouble with decision making, and we don't know who we are. This disconnection can also be described as self-betrayal. We betray our needs, our emotions, and desires in order to gain the love and approval from a caregiver. And again, this is an unconscious coping mechanism that allows us to survive an environment where our core emotional, physical, and spiritual needs aren't met. And so what does it look like to be disconnected from others? I appreciate the late psychoanalyst Karen Horney's research on the 3 strategies we implement when we're experiencing shame. So the strategies are moving towards, which is people-pleasing, moving against, which is trying to gain power over others, and moving away, which is withdrawing or hiding. All these strategies are a disconnection from our authentic self. But ultimately, when we're disconnected, we experience loneliness in relationships. When you don't engage from the truth of who you are, you're not seen, you're not heard, and you're not known. Your relationships may appear fine on the outside, but if you're responding from the part that's protecting you, you're not connected to self or others. It's only when we cultivate the courage and the vulnerability to step into who we really are will we find true connection. And what does it look like to be disconnected from God? And so we project our broken relational dynamics onto God. And so everything I mentioned about shame and disconnection in our relationships with others, we'll also find this relating to God. For example, if my dad was cold and distant, I'll project that onto God. God is cold and distant. Or we believe God is mad at us or disappointed in us, just like our caregiver. In the midst of all of this, Jesus invites us to wholeness. So the invitation to wholeness is an invitation to discover our authentic self, fully connected to self, others, and God. In Jesus, we are beloved and fully accepted. So I'm going to read 2 verses. The first one is Psalm 139:14. I will praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. And Ephesians 3:16 through 19. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with the power through the Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with the Lord's people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. So in Jesus, we discover our true identity as beloved daughters. It's amazing what this can look like when you live out of this place. In the last couple of years, I've thought a lot about people in my life who truly believe they're beloved by God, and they show up differently in the world. I have a friend and mentor who is just such a great example of this. I was at a retreat, and she was the main speaker, and I was so struck by her generosity. She had this enormous capacity to love and engage with others. And when she was up front, she shared about her fears and shortcomings with courage and vulnerability. And she had a confidence and ease about her. There was just this sense that she was home in her own body. And so I had dinner with her at the retreat, and I said to her, you know you're beloved, don't you? And she just started crying. And she said that she did, and she'd known this her entire life. This belovedness is the truth that Jesus speaks to us and about us. But if we're disconnected from self, others, or God, it's difficult to receive this. But the good news is, this is where God is taking us if we receive this invitation. So this is an invitation into a process to engage with the wounds of your life through the identity as beloved daughter. And this is a starting point. And if you're struggling to believe this, that's okay. Bring it to God and bring it to each other. We are called to help each other remember who we are. And so knowing ourselves as beloved transforms our relationships with self, others, and God. When we believe that we are loved just as we are, we're able to lower our defenses and increase our capacity for safety and awareness. So let's look at how our identity as beloved changes our relationship to self. When we know that we're beloved, we're able to have self-compassion, which is increased safety and awareness within ourself. And there are 3 aspects to self-compassion. The first is self-kindness. And self-kindness is being warm and understanding towards ourselves when we suffer, fail, or feel inadequate, rather than ignoring our pain and beating ourselves up with self-criticism. For example, it involves actively comforting ourselves, responding just as we would to a dear friend. And secondly, it involves common humanity. Common humanity recognizes that suffering and feelings of personal inadequacy are part of the shared human experience. It's something that we all go through rather than something that happens to me alone. And for example, we all have childhood wounds and we all did the best we could to survive. The third is mindfulness. Mindfulness is taking a balanced approach to negative emotions so that feelings are neither suppressed nor exaggerated. We can't ignore our pain and have compassion for it at the same time. So I want to share with you a mindfulness exercise to help you when you're dealing with big emotions. So first, name the emotion. So I'm suddenly feeling frustrated, angry, hopeless, or upset. And accept that it's happening. Don't fight it. It doesn't mean you have to like it. But when you stop fighting it, immediately you notice the release in some of the tension. And next, breathe. Breathe through your nose for 4 seconds. Hold your breath for 4 seconds, and then exhale for 4 seconds. And you can do this as many times as you like. And then pause. You don't have to react to something when you're upset. And the next, self-soothe. And this could be going for a walk, listening to calm music, praying, writing, whatever works for you. And then next, curiosity. When you're feeling calmer, approach the big feelings with curiosity, compassion, and honesty. Ask yourself, what's happening? And then share. Share with someone if needed. And so to learn more about self-compassion, there's a book by Kristen Neff called Self-Compassion. That's a great resource. And so that was a brief look at how identity as beloved changes our relationship with self. So how does our identity as beloved change our relationship with others? So we are wounded in relationship, so healing needs to happen in relationship. So we move from shame, which is fear, blaming self and others, and disconnection, to empathy, which is courage, compassion, and connection. Empathy fuels connection. Empathy is feeling with people. You may be feeling hopeless and overwhelmed, but you're not alone. Empathy says, I can meet you there and be with you. So I'm going to walk you through a shame resilience exercise found in the book, Daring Greatly, that will help you move from shame to empathy and healing. But first, here's a quote from Brené Brown about shame resilience. It's the ability to practice authenticity when we experience shame, to move through the experience and to come out the other side with more courage, compassion, and connection than we had going into it. Shame resilience is about moving from shame to empathy. Empathy is the real antidote to shame. So first, it's recognizing shame and understanding its triggers. So can you physically recognize when you're in the grips of shame? Feel your way through it and stay with that feeling. Figure out what messages and expectations triggered the shame. So an example may be, after being broken up with, this shame message is, no one will ever love me. And so once I recognize shame, I can, 2, practice critical awareness. And can you reality check the messages and the expectations that are driving shame? For example, is it true that no one will ever love me? We tell a story through the lens of our wounding, and part of our healing is growing in the awareness around the story we tell ourselves. And so, for example, I'm aware the story I'm telling myself is, because my dad left our family when I was 9 and my boyfriend broke up with me, no one will stay in my life. And then it's important to reach out and speak shame. So are you owning and sharing your story? Can you begin to risk vulnerability? So what was it like when your dad left? So what are your fears around abandonment? And what are the feelings around the breakup with the boyfriend? We can't experience empathy if we're not connecting. And so next, and this is so important, is seeking safe people to share your story. Are they worthy of your story? Are they present when you share? Are they able to listen without judgment? And lastly, are you asking for what you need when you experience shame? I need to know that I'm not alone. I need someone to be with me in my pain. I need to be heard, and I need a non-judgmental presence. So these are the 3 things that help shame resilience. So I've talked about how identity as beloved changes our relationship with self and others. Lastly, we'll look at how our identity as beloved changes our relationship to God. So when we come to know and believe that we're beloved by God, we can bring our darkest parts to God and not fear rejection or condemnation. We can enter into the massive freedom of being fully loved. I have 2 questions that I'll invite you to reflect on. Daring to trust that God is with you in the midst of all you are trying to escape or minimize. What would help you come to God with more vulnerability and more honesty? And next, how could meeting God in the vulnerability of your wounds and strategies help you to better know your authentic self? So there's a lot here, and I just want to acknowledge the courage it takes to enter into this. So my prayer is that you'd let God meet you just wherever you're at. So I want to bless you as you move from disconnected to connected, that you would experience the fullness and the freedom of being beloved. Thank you.